The man furiously slammed his fist against the wall, only to realize his hand had turned metallic. He could hardly believe his eyes, so he rushed to the nearest hospital. After a full-body examination, he found not only his arm had changed, his entire body was slowly turning into metal. He headed to the restroom to cool down, only to find out he could absorb electricity. Not just that, he could release it, blasting out 100,000 volts at will. Even Mr. Fantastic was no match for him, getting blasted away in an instant. Because this man was none other than Dr. Doom, the most powerful villain in the Marvel Universe. It all started a day earlier, during a scientific discussion led by Reed, the greatest mind in Marvel. He found the existence of a mysterious cosmic cloud. If they could collect a sample, it might unlock the key to modifying human genes, curing even the most impossible diseases. But to make it happen, he needed serious funding, so he turned to his old classmate Victor. Knowing Reed's genius, Victor agreed without hesitation. Then they went to the space station. A team was assembled, including Reed's ex Susan. After a brief discussion, the operator opened the hatch. But halfway through the mission, Reed noticed something was off. The cosmic cloud had arrived 7 hours early. He immediately warned everyone to get back inside, but it was too late. The cloud had already reached them. Even he reacted quickly and leaped toward the ship. He was still a step too slow. The energy invaded his body. The operator, Mr. Fantastic, and even Susan in the back all got caught in the storm. Luckily, the ship withstood the impact, and they made it back to Earth safely. But things weren't looking good. The space radiation had altered them all, each in a different way. For one, while skiing at insane speed, the man's body suddenly caught fire. No matter how much he smacked himself, the flames wouldn't go out. Panicked, he tumbled off a cliff, only to transform into the Human Torch and crash straight into the ground, burning a massive hole through 100 feet of snow. Yet he didn't have a single scratch. Meanwhile, Mr. Fantastic was having dinner with his girlfriend. They were chatting happily, until Susan got too emotional and started fading out of sight. Watching the floating wristwatch in front of her, she panicked and accidentally knocked over a wine bottle. Reacting fast, Mr. Fantastic stretched his arm like Luffy from One Piece and caught it just in time. As they sat there dumbfounded, Captain America clothes completely burned off rushed into the hotel, and his fingers sparked like flint when he snapped. The doctor knew something was wrong. Ben had taken in way more radiation than the rest of them. Sure enough, in the recovery chamber at the back, a bald man was writhing in pain. His heartbeat kept accelerating until it hit an insane 694 beats per second. The bed frame couldn't take it and snapped under the pressure. Outside the room, Reed was getting worried, but the door had been locked from the inside. Without the code, there was no way to open it. Just as everyone was panicking, Reed suddenly crouched down. He slid his arm into the gap under the door, and his fingers stretched like jelly, wiggling through the narrow space. Once they got through, his hand returned to normal and click, the lock turned from the inside. They rushed into the room only to find a massive hole in the wall, and their teammate was gone. Reed spotted a few scattered photos on the floor. That's when it hit him. The guy must have gone home. Sure enough, about 5 kilometers away inside a clothing store, the man picked out something to wear, then headed downstairs to call his wife. He was terrified she'd be scared of how he looked, so he tried to prepare her for it. But the moment he took off his hat, she screamed and ran. She couldn't handle the fact that her husband had turned into a giant rock monster. Heartbroken, he wandered to a bridge the next day, lost in thought. That's when he spotted a man about to jump. He tried to stop him, but the guy freaked out the moment he saw him and kept backing away. With no other choice, he stepped forward, but the man panicked and slipped off the bridge. A truck was coming right at him. With no time to think, the rock man jumped down after him. With one massive charge, he slammed into the truck, bringing it to a dead stop. The man was safe, but the crash triggered a chain reaction. Cars were wrecked left and right. The entire bridge turned into chaos. Then the truck driver started losing consciousness. Without hesitation, the rock man ripped the door off and yanked the entire seat out with the driver still in it. But instead of thanking him, the cops in the back suddenly pulled their guns. He had no idea what was going on, but he did as they said, slowly setting the driver down. Just then, a nearby car exploded. Startled, one of the cops accidentally pulled the trigger, but the bullet barely even tickled him. Right at that moment, Reed and the others arrived at the scene. The crowd was too thick to push through, so Susan turned invisible to sneak past and create a distraction. They finally made it to the wreckage, but as Susan climbed onto a car, she spotted a little girl trapped under the rubble, and the gas tank was about to blow. Just in time, the Human Torch swooped in. He shielded the girl as flames erupted toward them. The explosion sent fire raging everywhere, but he didn't feel a thing. Then Susan quickly threw up a force field, trapping the flames inside. Cut off from oxygen, the fire finally started to die down. But the fire truck behind them wasn't so lucky. Trying to avoid the shockwave from the explosion, the driver swerved, and the truck went skidding right off the bridge. They were about to plunge into the abyss, but at the last second, the rock man stepped up. He grabbed the bumper with his bare hands, and with sheer brute force, he pulled the entire fire truck back up. The crowd erupted into cheers. People started calling them the Fantastic Four. From that day on, the name Fantastic Four became a symbol of justice and courage. Just then, the Rockman's wife arrived at the scene, but she wasn't there to celebrate. Without saying a word, she took off her ring and walked away without looking back. He reached down to pick up the ring, but seeing his own rocky fingers just made it hurt even more. Reed quickly stepped in, breaking the awkward silence. He promised, no, swore, he'd find a way to turn him back to normal. After that, they all headed to Reed's apartment. But when they tried taking the elevator to his rooftop lab, an alert popped up: overweight. With no other choice, the Rockman had to take the stairs. Once everyone was in the lab, Reed ran a full-body scan on him. First up, the Rockman. Every single one of his organs had turned to solid rock. Reed couldn't believe his eyes. The only silver lining? His leg still had a knee-jerk reflex, which meant his nerves were still working. Next was Susan. Turned out she wasn't actually turning invisible. She was bending light to make herself disappear. Problem was, normal clothes didn't have the same ability, so every time she vanished, she had to strip completely. And then came the Human Torch. He raised a hand. Whoosh! Flames engulfed his entire body. At Reed's command, he pushed the temperature higher and higher, until suddenly, he nearly took off flying. The heat was getting out of control. The instruments were starting to melt. Reed barely managed to activate the fire suppression system in time. After analyzing the data, they found out his max temperature was hotter than the surface of the sun, hot enough to ignite the atmosphere. Reed immediately warned him, do not push your limits. Determined to find a cure, Reed spent every day crunching numbers, running impossible calculations. But knowing a cure might take time, he designed specialized suits for everyone, tailored to their abilities. That way, at least, they wouldn't have to keep dealing with wardrobe malfunctions. Then, the very next morning, Captain America, unable to sit still, snuck out. He entered a local motorcycle race, revving his engine to the max, pulling off insane stunts as the crowd roared for him. The attention got to his head. Feeling cocky, he let go of the handlebars mid-air. Big mistake. Bam! He crashed hard. Mid-fall, he managed to go full fire mode, but he didn't have enough control yet. He slammed into the ground. His bike totaled. Everyone thought he was dead for sure. The whole crowd went silent, and then he stood up, not a single scratch on him. Right now, he was feeling unstoppable. So much so that at the post-race press conference, he started running his mouth, straight up trashing his teammates. He mocked Reed, saying he turned all soft and stretchy. Then he called the Rockman their team's pet. That was it. The three of them were pissed. They stormed over to the race venue. There, sitting off to the side, was his sports car. Without a word, the Rockman reached out and crushed it into a metal ball. That did it. Flames erupted in his hands as he hurled a fireball straight at the Rockman's head. Then he lunged forward, aiming for his face. Didn't do much damage, but it was enough to piss the big guy off. Not about to back down, he geared up for a full-blown fight. But before things got out of hand, the Invisible Woman stepped in, cutting them off. With no choice, they all backed off and walked away. What none of them realized was that this fight nearly tore them apart for good. Later that night, the Rockman wandered into a bar. With every step, the ground shook beneath him. When he finally reached the bar, he sat down. The stool shattered under his weight. He picked up a glass. It crumbled like wet paper. The whole bar went silent, hopeless. He slumped into a dark corner, drowning in misery. That's when Victor showed up. With a sympathetic smile, he sat down and said, "I get it, buddy, really, I do." He told him that Reed swore he'd find a cure. But let's be real. Right now, all his attention was on Susan. Their so-called promise, long forgotten. At first, the Rockman didn't want to believe it, but when he got back to base, there they were, Reed and Susan, coming back from a date. That was the last straw. Rage bubbling over. "You're a backstabbing, selfish jerk!" Before Reed could react, he shoved him to the ground. Then he turned towards Susan. Reed sprang into action, leaping onto him, stretching his arms, wrapping around him like a boa constrictor. The Rockman grabbing Reed and tossing him aside like he weighed nothing. But Reed snapped right back, like a human bungee cord, until finally the Rockman was completely tied up. His rage started to fade. Once Reed was sure he'd calmed down, he slowly let go. But just as he did, the Rockman looked at him and said, Then he just turned and walked away with anger. What he didn't know was that Reed never forgot his promise. Every single day he pushed himself to the limit, until finally he built it, a reverse mutation device, but the data wasn't stable. That's why he hadn't told anyone. But now his best friend was gone. So screw it. If no one else could test it, he would. Without hesitation, he stepped into the chamber. The doors slid shut. Solar energy surged through the machine, the entire building flickering with blinding light. By the time Susan rushed to the scene, she found Reed's skin loosening, his body slowly collapsing like a pile of melted wax. Clearly, the experiment had failed. And the reason? Not enough energy. Wasting no time, Susan grabbed Reed and took him for treatment. But what she didn't realize, Victor had seen everything. Then he picked up his phone and called Ben. He invited him to the lab, saying he could help him turn back to normal. His powers, Victor claimed, were the perfect solution to the energy problem. As the power levels began to drop, he threw open the chamber door and shoved his arm inside. Lightning surged. Electricity crackled. And then, Ben stood there. Human. Normal. It had worked. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Ben stepped forward, about to to thank Victor. Wham! Victor slapped him across the face. It was a setup. He never cared about helping. This was all just a way to get rid of Reed's strongest ally. Hearing the commotion, Reed came rushing in. Bzzzt! A bolt of 100,000 volts sent him flying. He never stood a chance. Before he could even react, Victor launched him across the room. Reed scrambled, grabbing onto a ledge, but his overheated rubber body had turned soft and weak. His fingers slipped. He plummeted off the rooftop. Victor snatched him up like a piece of garbage. Then, to hide his monstrous face, he donned a custom steel mask. Dr. Doom had arrived. Victor wasn't done. He froze Reed solid, snapped his fingers, crack. Once he was completely helpless, Victor pulled out a missile, aimed it at Johnny, and fired. A heat-seeking missile. Johnny's eyes widened. Without thinking, he leaped off the building. The missile locked onto him and shot after him. Thinking fast, he ignited his whole body, turning into a human fireball. But no matter how fast he flew, the missile stayed right on his tail. He blasted fireballs to throw it off, but the tracking system was too damn smart. Then, he saw it, an old rusted cargo ship. He dived straight for it, set it ablaze, and at the last second, boom! The explosion rocked the sea, taking the missile with it. But Susan wasn't so lucky. Just as she was about to unlock Reed's cuffs, Victor, who had been waiting for this moment, sprung into action. She turned visible. Desperate, she tried to reason with him, but Victor wasn't interested. Before she could react, he blasted her across the room. Then he grabbed her by the throat, tightened his grip. He was going to kill her, just in the nick of time. The Rockman came through. Then he threw a haymaker, putting his whole back into it. Turns out, Ben willingly turned himself back into a monster, just to save his friends. But just as he was about to free Reed, Victor ambushed him from behind. The two crashed through the building, falling straight into a swimming pool. But their fight was so intense, they shattered the pool's floor, sending them both plummeting, right into a garbage truck below. The battle raged on. Ben got thrown clean out of the fight, and now Victor, fully transformed into a living thunder god, with a flick of his wrist, he blasted a police car into pieces. Bullets hit his body, but they might as well have been mosquito bites. Even when a whole damn car got hurled at him, he didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed a metal bat and home run. Then he turned back, ready to finish Ben for good, but before he could strike, wham! A force field slammed into place. Susan had arrived. And right on cue, Johnny and Reed rushed in. The Fantastic Four. Finally together. But Victor didn't even blink. Lightning surged around him. Electricity crackled through the air, pulling in every volt around him. Human Torch got yeeted like a rag doll. Even the jacked-up Rockman went airborne. Susan held him off with a sonic blast. That was Reed's cue. He grabbed a trash can from behind, and thwack! Then he stretched, wrapping around Victor like a rubber straitjacket, locking him in place. Johnny saw the opening. Supernova. A swirling vortex of flames spiraled around Victor, burning hotter than the surface of the sun. To keep the heat from escaping, Susan threw up an invisible barrier, trapping the fire inside. Victor screamed. The flames engulfed him, melting his armor, turning him into molten lava. He laughed through the pain. Is that all you've got? But he didn't realize. Ben was already in position. Ben busted open a fire hydrant. A blast of water shot out, drenching Victor's molten form. And right there in front of the entire city, he turned to stone. The Fantastic Four had won. Cheers erupted from the crowd. With Victor defeated, things started falling into place. Ben finally found a woman who loved him for who he was. And Reed? He got down on one knee and proposed to Susan. Still want more? Then hit that follow button.